Go ahead, Larry.
Right. There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Korean Issues webinar sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation. It's my pleasure to introduce the president of the Washington Times Foundation and Universal Peace Federation, Dr. Michael Jenkins. He's also chairman of Washington Briefs, Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Washington Times news organization. He's led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan that have met with legislative and executive, intelligence, and military leadership of those countries. As president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long experience conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in Northeast Asia and Middle East. We're very happy to have this broadcast today and our guests. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Larry. And thank you to Alan Jessen for helping with this program, which is sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation and also the Washington Times Foundation. Our first guest speaker today will be Mr. Robert Manning, and our topic is of great interest to all of us as Americans. Computer chips are the new oil, China and the Indo-Pacific geopolitics. So it's very important that we really understand the current geopolitical situation and how the microchips that are being produced, especially in Taiwan, which is the largest producer, is very critical to everything going on with our economy and security. Mr. Robert Manning is a distinguished senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Project. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, Robert served as a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And previously, he served as acting deputy national intelligence officer for economics at the National Intelligence Center, a senior strategist of the National Counterproliferation Center in the Office of the DNI, and as director of long-range energy and regional global affairs of the U.S. National Intelligence Council's Strategic Futures Group from 2008 to 10. From earlier, Robert served as a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's Policy Planning, and from 2001 to 2005, he was senior counselor for energy, technology, and science policy at the United States State Department, and where he advised the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. From 1997 to 2001, he was Director of Asian Studies and a senior fellow on the Council of Foreign Relations. His publications include two major Atlantic Council technology monograph reports, The Global Innovation Sweepstakes and Keeping America's Innovation Edge. Books include The Asian Energy Factor and China, Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control. He has published essays on nuclear weapons, numerous journals and journal articles in international energy and Asian security issues. Roughly half a dozen book chapters and edited volumes on China, Korea, Japan, regional security, architecture, energy, and energy security. He's widely published in the Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, National Interest, New York Times, Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, as well as Korean publications. Please welcome with me Mr. Robert A. Manning. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. What I'm going to say might seem a little contradictory given the summit we had yesterday in Bali between President Biden and Xi Jinping, but I'll show you how all the pieces fit together. But I want to focus on the October 7th export ban that Biden put in place, because I think it's really a watershed in our U.S.-China relationship. What it did was ban advanced chips and chip-making equipment for artificial intelligence and supercomputers, and this is sort of, you have to, the context, you have to understand the context that we're in a knowledge economy, and all the emerging technologies, AI, robotics, big data, biotech, 3D printing, Internet of Things, all depend, the DNA of all of them is computer chips. And so controlling the high-end sector really it gives you a strategic advantage in terms of economic competition. And because most of these technologies have at least some US component, this leads us to see that China is going to be choked off from that top level of the value chain. And so I see that as a watershed. You remember in the past, we kept saying we don't, in fact, in his address last May, a major China's policy speech, Secretary Blinken said, we don't intend to keep China down. We don't want to stop their growth. Well, this is exactly what this move does. You can say it was a good move, for better or worse. Maybe you could view it as a payback for all the Chinese IPR theft and forced technology turnovers and so on. But in any case, it's really a seminal development. And how effective it will be will play out. Right now, the whole industry is kind of introspective, trying to figure out what the details of this load of regulations are and how it affects particular chips. Broadly, don't you remember, China imports about $300 billion in semiconductor chips a year, many from the US, Korea, Japan, and major companies like Qualcomm get a large portion of their profits from business in China. And so, but this is distinguishing, in other words, I'm not sure if we care strategically whether we sell China chips for cell phones or tablets or other devices, because those are lower end chips. But at the higher level, this goes back to the first move in this direction was by President Trump when he banned Huawei. And the logic of it was because all these technologies are mostly dual use, he wanted to ban anything that had military applications. And that was the logic for this too, but this goes beyond it, banning it across the board. And so the question will be, how our allies, for example, the Dutch have a monopoly on lithography etching for chips. How will they respond? Japan has a large share of certain chemicals for computer chips, and so on. And so we don't know. Some of these countries' industry may think it's somehow protectionist, and that the U.S. is trying to corner the market on this. And so we don't know how they're going to respond, and I'm not sure they do either. I think there's a lot of discussion going on. The U.S. hope is to multilateralize it. The Biden administration tried to get other countries on board before taking this unilateral step, but failed. And they're hoping once it's in place that they can create we have this Wassenaar agreement on limiting technology exports, and they're hoping to create an arrangement like that. But it's not clear whether other producers, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the EU countries are going to go along with that. So that's a question mark. But in terms of how China sees it, the one thing we're wondering about is how will China retaliate? So far, they've been very quiet, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. The move happened right before their 20th Party Congress, when they wanted to keep things quiet and didn't want any fireworks. And And then after that, we had the moves toward the Biden-Xi summit. And I think both sides, behind the logic behind the summit, I think both sides were nervous that this death spiral of tit for tat reaction was getting out of control. And so you may have seen as a result of the summit, they're reinstituting a whole range of dialogues, climate cooperation, food security, energy, and so on. We'll see how that goes. All it is a commitment to talk and restore dialogues. But looming the gray cloud over it is this national economic nationalist trade policy as exhibited by the semiconductor ban. And so the irony of all this is despite all the tariffs and export bans and so on, U.S.-China trade continues to grow. It was $571 billion in 2021, and it's expected to be around that, if not a little bigger, for 2022. And this gets back, if we get into tit for tat reactions, for example, China could ban the export of rare earth minerals, which we need for a lot of these technologies, electric vehicles, and so on. Or they could ban TV screens that they produce a large percentage of, or worse, they could try to go after our economy and cut off imports of American farmers' goods and airplane purchases like Boeing. So I think you have to look at the relationship as kind of a mutually assured economic destruction as what could unfold here. Normally in these trade issues, if we're going to ban them, that ought to be the beginning of a talk to negotiate. Would China roll back its massive surpluses, our industrial policy, the unfair trading practices, if the U.S. loosened these up? We don't know, and I think one mistake of our policy is we haven't tested China on any of these things. We've just assumed and acted on it. And I think that's one of the core assumptions of the Biden administration is that China can't change. And I think that argument is not upheld by history. Just look at from the time the Communist Party took power in 1949. We had all of Mao's disastrous Great Leap Forward and so on that killed millions of people. And then we had Deng markets and opening, and now we have Xi, which is kind of rolling back and undoing Deng's reforms. So who's to say there can't be another change? And that's why my argument is that we should be testing them. It may not be possible, but I don't think we lose anything by testing them rather than simply assuming the worst and acting on it. I don't want to say much more now. We'll get into all these other issues, I think, in the discussion, and I'd prefer to do it that way. So I'll turn it back over to Michael.
Thank you, Robert. Excellent. It's intriguing, the situation of the United States and China in terms of economic trade and also interdependence in many ways. It's not a simple issue to get the balance. But we thank you, and we're looking forward to some Q&A and discussion. Our next speaker is Mr. Clark Packard. Clark is a research fellow at the Cato Institute's Herbert A. Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies. Prior to joining Cato, Mr. Packard was a resident fellow at the R Street Institute, focusing on international trade policy. Previously worked at the National Taxpayers Union, doing the same. Prior to those roles, he served as an attorney and policy advisor to two South Carolina governors. Earlier in his career, he spent 3 years in private legal practice. Clark is a contributor to Foreign Policy and National Review, as well as the Bulwark and Business Insider. The National Interest and other publications has also published him. He has appeared on a number of television and radio programs to discuss international trade policy, the graduate of the University of South Carolina School of Law. We're very honored to present to you this day Mr. Clark Packard. Welcome, Clark.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is a timely discussion. I should preface my remarks by saying that I'm not a semiconductor expert. In fact, I'm sort of a Luddite. I spend most of my time explaining what Adam Smith and David Ricardo taught us back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And I should also probably preface my remarks by saying that, I do think that China is an increasingly illiberal actor on the world stage and engages in repressive human rights practices. And I'm not an expert on U.S. grand strategy. I think mostly about the U.S.-China trade and investment relationship, which means I'm having to spend a lot of time boning up on understanding the export controls and semiconductors in particular. I think, at a high level, technology and technological supremacy is at the heart of U.S.-China competition right now. And I think standard setting is a really paramount concern. Who will control the commanding heights of technology in the 21st century? In theory, export controls can be powerful tools to protect U.S. national security and technological considerations. It makes sense, for example, to prohibit the export of materials necessary to make nuclear weapons, or ban an American from providing technical details about nuclear weapons to some foreign adversary. Those are trade restrictions, even if absolutist free trader like me at the Cato Institute can support. But it's a thornier calculus where the product or service in question has both military and civilian applications, such as semiconductors. Dual-use technologies that, again, have both civilian and military capabilities and applications are central to China's sort of civilian-military fusion. The new export controls are a significant departure from the existing status quo. Under the old system, the U.S. banned exports of semiconductors to Chinese military and defense purposes, but permitted sales for civilian and commercial purposes. And now high-end chips and AI can no longer be sold to any entity operating in China, whether that's the Chinese military, a Chinese tech company, or even a U.S. company operating a data center in China. Likewise, the new rules and restrictions prohibit any U.S. or non-U.S. company from supplying targeted Chinese entities with hardware or software whose supply chains contain American technology. Likewise, they prohibit American citizens from working in Chinese semiconductor industry at all, including the Dutch semiconductor company ASML that Robert made reference to. The old U.S. policy, I thought, was that the United States just needed to run faster than China, which I think it has largely done successfully. But the new policy basically says we need to run faster, but we also need to slow China down. And I think that that's the second part of that is the significant departure. The export controls were imposed pursuant to the Export Control Reform Act of 2018. And they were done unilaterally, as Robert mentioned, but even the ECRA, the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, says, quote, export controls should be fully coordinated with multilateral export control regimes. Export controls that are multilateral are most effective. That tends to be my thought as well. And the U.S., as Robert mentioned, has decided that it will go alone with this policy and then hope that others jump on board. I'm somewhat skeptical of that. If China can eventually source these products from third-party countries, home of U.S. competitors, we've not enhanced U.S. national security, and instead we've simply denied sales and revenue to a U.S. firm. An overly stringent export control regime, likewise, could dissuade new firms from opening up operations in the United States or provide incentive for offshoring of existing firms. I did find the timing of the Biden administration's announcement odd. The party Congress was about to begin, as Robert mentioned. U.S. Elections were going on, but also back in July, Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. And so as part of that, about $80 billion was dedicated over the next 10 years to essentially reshoring production of semiconductors into the United States. So it's odd to me that policymakers are prioritizing bolstering U.S. semiconductor manufacturing, but at the same time denying them sales that they need to stay at the top of the food chain. I think the policy hobbled China's technology industry pretty quickly. We'll see what happens there. I have two concerns there. First, the policy could further convince Xi in the top of the CCP that their industrial policy and their push for technological self-reliance are the right ideas, exacerbating sort of the industrial policy that American companies complain about a lot. I also think that China being cut out of the supply chain may hasten they're looking at taking control of Taiwan because Taiwan is such a prominent and very successful producer of semiconductors. Like Robert, I also worry about Chinese retaliation. I think banning the export of rare earth minerals is, I think, potentially likely. Other countries use a number of those products. And so, I think that could pose some problems. I also worry about alienating the very allies that we need to be sort of rallying to put pressure on China to change its commercial practices and raise some standards. So the question to me is what do you do about it now? And what do you do about thinking through export control policy moving forward? I published a piece a while back kind of laying out some guardrails that I think make sense. I think multilateral export control should be the standard where we determine that they are necessary. Making an effort at rallying other countries makes sense. If you're going to start a fight, you want a gang on your side. I think there needs to be a tighter definition of national security. The Trump administration abused national security to levy a number of really misguided tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. That clearly were, Canadian steel is not a national security threat to the United States, but that was the Trump administration's claim there. I would also like to see a sunset date for export controls, whereby the government would need to have an obligation to show that the export controls are still necessary and not just a continuation, because an export control or a product may be used for civilian or for national security purposes now, but in a couple of years, it's mostly, used for commercial or civilian purposes. And I don't think that we should be banning those kinds of products. I would like to see a little more judicial scrutiny of export controls. I think as of now, courts generally defer and give carte blanche to the executive branch's claims of national security. And I also think the Commerce Department, who is in charge of implementing these regulations, should be required to work with exporting firms to see if there are ways to mitigate potential national security risks to the United States and our allies. In conclusion, I think, again, China does pose legitimate challenges for the United States and the rest of the world's sort of market-oriented democracies. I tend to think that China's economic might right now is overstated. They face significant headwinds in their economy outside of the zero COVID policy. They have huge demographic issues, and perhaps we can get into those. But at the same time, I think the U.S. needs a strong and vibrant domestic economy, of which exports play a prominent role. And you need those things, a strong and vibrant economy, to bolster your national security. And I worry about the economic ramifications of this decision. Ultimately, I'm somewhat skeptical, but I could be convinced that they are perhaps necessary right now, but I just don't think that the case has been made sufficiently. So with that, I will turn it back, and I look forward to questions and the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Clark. And I'd like to bring Robert on the screen if we could. So we would like to open up the discussion first about China and the fact that President Xi Jinping was just reelected on October 23rd by the Communist Party of China in the 20th session, and now has another 5-year term, and many say that means he's guaranteed his position for life. And what is the strategy from your points of view on China and the motivation to overtake Taiwan for the microchip production that they have? What's your thinking on that? Is that the main motivation, or is it the reunification of China? Robert, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, look, for the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan is an existential issue. She talks to, if you look at their language they use, she talks about rejuvenation of the Chinese nation can't be complete until Taiwan is part of China again, and so on. And so, I think one way or another, they aim to force or coerce some kind of unification with Taiwan. Their old argument of, was based on Hong Kong. That's one of the reasons Deng Xiaoping did the one country, two systems. He was thinking about Taiwan in Hong Kong. Now the Chinese have destroyed Hong Kong as we've known it, and I'm very fond of Hong Kong. I've spent a lot of time there, and it was a great place. They're making it. They're basically hollowing out the provisions that were agreed to and turning it gradually into just another province of China. And so this has zero appeal in Taiwan. The Taiwanese have no interest in it at all. And the Chinese have zero credibility on this. So I'm somewhat distressed that for the last 2 years, everybody in town has been jumping up and down and saying the Chinese are coming and they're going to invade next week. We're a ways from that. Even if China wanted to invade, they don't have the amphibious assault capability. Think back what it took the U.S. military to take the Solomon Islands or Guadalcanal in World War II. It's an enormous task involving what the Chinese would have to do is the equivalent of the D-Day landing at Normandy. They don't have the capability yet, and I don't think they'll have it by 2027 either. On the other hand, they have a lot of non-kinetic means of coercion, that they can apply to Taiwan. They have 400,000 hostages. They're Taiwanese living in the mainland. $500 billion in Taiwanese investment. They could cut off. They could fry their cyber links. There's a number. I could go on, but and I know the Taiwanese are aware of this. There's a lot of other means of squeezing Taiwan. I think a lot of the Chinese intention is to force the U.S. to be the one who escalates. So if they use non-kinetic needs, what would the U.S. do? We'd have to take act, or even a naval embargo. We'd have to fire the first shots. I don't think it'll happen anytime soon. And in fact, the language at the 20th Party Congress, there were a number of changes in the Chinese view of the global situation, but the language on Taiwan was pretty much the same. It did not change. There was no reference to any timeline. So, because if you look at it from Xi Jinping's perspective, if he tries to do something and fails, the Communist Party is out of business. So I think he's going to want to have it pretty well wired before he does anything.
Very good, Robert. Clark, any thoughts on China's motivation and relationship to Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company? And the
I mean,
of our chips, not our chips, but the highest quality chips in the world are produced there. What does China want to do?
I think Xi knows that, to continue the Chinese Communist Party's rise, they need access to semiconductors, and they need access to the high-tech stuff. But yeah, I mean, I worry that, that it could potentially hasten their, decisions. And I agree with Robert. Militarily, maybe not, but I also, I was in Taiwan, I guess about September of 2019 was the last time I was in Taiwan. And in my conversations there, it was less about sort of the militarily, aggression. It's more in terms of things like shutting down their, power grid, cyber attacks, and leading up to elections and things like that, the sort of interference in Taiwan. But yeah, I think that China is an increasingly aggressive actor. But I also think that they think that they have a little bit of time on their side, as they are able to continue to grow their economy, become stronger, and then perhaps they're in a better position if they wanted to make a move on Taiwan. I would say that some of the things that are pushing against that, right? It would be very similar to if they cut access to rare earths, for example, is the market reaction would be pretty swift and severe. And I think that you scare off the kind of companies that Xi and they, for a while anyway, the Chinese have tried to cultivate sort of Western multinationals doing business there. Those companies would just instantly sort of uproot and flee, similar to what we saw with in Ukraine with Russia's invasion there. So
the Chips and Science Act that was passed by Congress and hailed by President Biden right before the 20th Congress in China, what does that do for security? And also, it seems like it's a windfall for Micron and so many of the chip producers in America. Suddenly, there's huge cash available to develop, which is good in terms of not being dependent. But help us understand what are the good and the not so good aspects of the Chips and Science Act. Well, right back to you, Clark. Any thoughts on that, and then come back to Robert and same question.
Sure. I was very skeptical of the Chips and Science Act. I thought that at its core, it basically is just, from my perspective, nothing but corporate welfare for already fairly sizable existing U.S. semiconductor and producers. And I'm increasingly skeptical that high-tech industrial policy is really the solution to this challenge. But the Cato Institute's arguments did not win the day. There were some decent provisions of the bill that I thought dealt with, potentially some high-tech immigration or high-skilled immigration, that kind of stuff I would like to see more of. But ultimately, I just don't think that the way you outcompete China is through inefficient subsidies to well-connected corporations. And I've in previous writings, I've laid out sort of the economics of that position in terms of alienating key allies. I know the South Koreans are not thrilled with this. I know the Japanese are not thrilled with this. And again, those are the kind of countries that the United States needs. If we were sort of doing it the way I've suggested, you put together a coalition to really leverage market power over the Chinese. But I'm skeptical that it will change much. I think there's a big lag in terms of building production facilities for semiconductors, and we're also potentially heading toward an era of glut where the market is just completely flooded with semiconductors since everybody seems to be subsidizing them.
Very good. Okay, Robert.
I see things similarly to Clark. We've seen this story before. If you think back to the 1980s when it was Japan that was going to take over the world, we created the Semitech, which was subsidizing production here. And I would say at best it was a mixed success. And so I agree with Clark. I think, look, we trained thousands of Indian, Chinese, other Asian STEM PhDs, and then we send them back home to compete against us. So I think expanding H-1B visas is a smart move. Other countries have played off this. Canada offers open immigration just precisely because we don't. And that I think the investment in R&D is exactly right. We need more of that. To the degree that the CHIPS Act was kind of was generated by a kind of Sputnik moment where we realized that we weren't the single superpower anymore, and China was more than just a copycat. I think that's healthy, but I certainly think we need to figure out ways to have more in production here. If you think about, but the whole pattern of innovation really since the late 1970s and the explosion of IT and the digital economy has not been guided by governments. It's been the exact opposite. I mean, you go to Silicon Valley, most of the tech people hate government. They don't want to have anything to do with it. And they think they're going to save the world through technology. So I'm somewhat skeptical, and what troubles me more though is the precedent, right? Make America, buy America. Well, what happens if everybody else follows our lead? What happened to free and open? And so that there's a danger there as well. Have we lost Michael?
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say we both mentioned that the risks of retaliation, and I think there's some reasons why they haven't. Partly because it's difficult for them to think through what the most effective retaliation is. There, as you pointed out, we don't talk about this very much, but the Chinese economy is in very bad shape. They have a huge property crisis, and property's been driven their economic growth 29% of the GDP, and that they have a huge debt problem. That zero COVID has shut down industries in all kinds of major cities, and more broadly, the whole development model that their growth has been based on, which was subsidized state-led investment, has kind of run its course. It doesn't work anymore. And at the same time, Xi Jinping is doubling down on it. So I don't think he can succeed. I think they're going to have to, and the reason he's doubling down on it is because he's a control freak. And he's cracked down. How do you innovate when you crack down on all the major tech companies in China? And Chinese entrepreneurs and the private sector are intimidated now. They don't know. It's a very bad investment environment. They're afraid to invest anywhere because they don't know what the government's going to do next.
Yeah.
And most of it was an outgrowth of, Alibaba.
Thank
you. Thank you, Robert. I apologize. I thought I had a little more power left and I could ask one more question and it shut down on me, but we're back. We have a couple questions from our audience here. What's a real economic situation in China? Is there any weaknesses that could cause a great reduction? We hear their economy's not doing that well. Evergreen is a very huge corporation that is basically on the ropes for bankruptcy. They overbuilt endless housing units for people. They're sitting there, brand new buildings, sitting there empty, and they're going to even tear a lot of them down. It's really something. What is the weakness of China, Clark, in terms of being a threat, and how does that relate with their need for chips and the world's need for chips?
Yeah, I think Robert was talking a lot about sort of the headwinds that the Chinese economy is facing. And I would add, I think the biggest driver right now on sort of a systemic level is a very serious demographic problem. And, the replacement rate tends to be, 2.1 births per woman to sustain, the levels of population in any given country. In the United States, that rate is about 1.6 right now. And we can supplement that through immigration. But in China, it's well below where the US is, for example, and they don't have much immigration. And so, the UN projects that China's population will go from, 1.4 billion to, by the end of this century, it will look like 700 million. And that's a significant contraction. And so I think that is a long-term driver of economic stagnation. And it kind of gets to what Robert was talking about. Again, the way you could supplement that is by making it an attractive place for people to move, but people don't want to move to China. The ecosystem, particularly in technology companies, is pretty tightly circumscribed. You have to get approval from the party Congress or, from government apparatchiks to do research. And that's not the sort of environment that we have found that technology flourishes in Silicon Valley in the United States. People want to have more freedom to make decisions on investment, but also on the kind of research that's going to drive growth in the 21st century. So I'm fairly bearish right now about the Chinese economy, and I think that there are certainly problems with a collapsing Chinese economy, right? The U.S. is dependent on exports to China. We get a lot of stuff from China. And I also think there's a humanitarian story here. When Deng sort of liberalized markets, in the late 70s, my understanding is the research shows like 600 or 700 million people were lifted out of grinding poverty. That's a tremendous humanitarian success story. But today, you have 1.4 billion people in China. Only 100 million of them have any connection to the Chinese Communist Party, meaning you have 1.3 billion people who are just out there trying to live their lives and do the best they can. And so I worry about a really stagnant economy. But by the same token, you could argue that the strengthening Chinese economy makes them more aggressive militarily and aggressive on a foreign policy side. So it's an interesting conversation and debate, but I do think that there are significant headwinds that are really sort of dragging on the economy right now.
Robert?
I would actually go further. I think they're stuck in a middle income trap, which very few developing companies have made their way out of, South Korea being one of them.
Yeah.
And they know what they need to do, but politically it's too difficult to do. So instead, she has just doubled down on the old system. When you insist that Communist Party committee be on the board of every company, it raises the question in my mind: what is the private sector in China? Is there one? In terms of WTO definitions and how it works. And so I think that what he's doing is not going to succeed. Their growth is going to be very flat over the next decade. They have a labor shortage, as Clark was pointing out. And they just keep doing the same, like the whole Belt and Road project was essentially exporting overproduction. That's what it was mainly about. And it's failing. It's quite frankly, it's failing pretty badly. I mean, they're everywhere you look. It's not a great success, even though we keep seeing it as this great boogeyman that's going to take over the world. I think what we're more seeing is the ugly Chinese from the perspective of a lot of developing countries. So I think they're in serious trouble, and I think now some people argue that what we're seeing is peak China, and that and that this, since they're at their height of where they're going to get to, that this is going to tempt them to act militarily. I'm not sure that that's true, because I think that Politburo of the Communist Party knows if they can't keep people employed, it's not going to work, whether they invade Taiwan or not. And so I think I don't know what will happen, but as I say, we've seen change within the Communist Party in the past. The problem now is Xi has undone all the framework that Deng Xiaoping laid down in terms of a bureaucratic system and some checks on and balances to a certain degree on a single leader. It was become more of a collective leadership. Now he runs everything, every special. They have leading committees. He's on all of them. So if anything goes wrong, guess whose fault it's going to be? And I don't know who he's going to try to blame it on, but I think most Chinese will know where the fault lies. And he's also kind of changed the social contract in China. 10, 15 years ago, if you stayed out of politics, you had a fair amount of personal freedom in terms of books to read, music to listen to, travel. And he's shut all that down. He's advising people what to wear, what books you can read, what music and art, and so on. And I think when you have a middle class of 400 or 500 million people, that doesn't go down very well, who have been used to a little more latitude. So I'm not predicting any outcome. I'm just saying that they're not in great shape. And we keep portraying them as 10 feet tall and about to take over the world. And I think it's a little more complicated than that.
Very good, very good. This is a hopeful program today. I've heard just the opposite at some of our other programs, and we all know there's very serious threats here. But at the same time, I also agree, Robert, that sometimes it is exaggerated. What is the weakness of China in terms of precious metals and not only fossil fuels and everything else? What are the key elements that China needs from the United States or other countries? Where are their mineral resources deficient? Where are there other technologies and actual natural metals? Where is the weakness? Where do they get it from? Go ahead, Clark. Or
go ahead, Robert.
All right. Well, I mean, that's not a weakness. They have most of their overseas investment has been about securing natural resources, oil, metal, coal, and so on. They have a climate problem. I read a book on Asian energy 20 years ago, and at that time, China was 71% dependent on coal for electricity. Now, 20 years later, they've invested billions of dollars in nuclear power, in solar power, renewables, and guess what? They're still 57% dependent on coal, and they're still building new coal plants despite they're the number one emitter of greenhouse gases. So I think that's a problem that they haven't quite thought their way out of, because their energy demand is so huge. That's why they moved closer to Saudi Arabia, and they get a lot of oil from the Middle East, and they built pipelines through Central Asia and with Russia they're trying to reduce their dependency on the Middle East. But I think I'm not sure that is necessarily a weakness right now. It in a way it gives them some leverage, because I mean, it would be the destruction would be mutual, but if they wanted to push back against us and make us suffer, they could do that.
Go ahead, Clark. And Clark, along with that, please address the GDP of China and the reality of it. But first, where are they dependent? And thank you to Robert on that.
Outside of the energy context, if you go back to the Section 301 report that the Trump administration released, that it sort of laid the foundation for the trade war. One of the indictments in that document, it talks about cyber hacking and the theft of intellectual property. And not only that, but understanding trade secrets and sort of hacking trade secrets. And so I think, in the title of this talk, are semiconductors the new oil? Probably sort of in the 21st century, I do think that that's sort of where the competition will lie. So they are, and this new policy will hurt their technology industry in the short run. And so, yeah, I do think that is a major concern for them. And how do they secure the future? If you really want to sort of establish your dominance in the commanding heights and the standard setting of technology going forward. The second part of the question about China's GDP, I don't know off the top of my head what it is. They are the second largest economy in the world. And people for a long time were very bullish about China and said, well, all these factors will contribute to growth in China. And we figure by, 2027, 2020 or 2030, maybe China will have the largest economy in the world. I'm increasingly of the position that they will probably never catch the United States, at least in my lifetime. I think that there are so many headwinds that the economy faces that are going to be significant detractors from future growth. And so I'm increasingly skeptical that they'll become, overtake the U.S., particularly if the United States can make some reforms to sort of make our economy stronger and more efficient. I think ultimately that's the most important thing that we in the policy community around DC and in Congress, people need to think about is it's not so much what China does, but our destiny is controlled by us. And if we make our economy stronger, and there are a number of ways you could do that, and obviously some of that is potentially controversial or debatable. But ultimately, I do think that the lodestar of U.S. policy needs to be to simply outcompete China. And how do you make our economy more efficient? Because ultimately, we don't have as much control over the Chinese economy as certain people in Washington seem to think. That these levers of power, you can potentially change China's commercial practices on the margin, but ultimately you need it to be in their self-interest to make the changes you want to see happen. And again, I think that there are steps we could take internally that would bolster our competitiveness vis-a-vis China.
When we think about the economy of China, one question I have, are their numbers inflated? They've inflated a lot of things in the past. And secondly, Robert, how much was the American investors, Wall Street, and policies of the U.S. government responsible for this economic growth? Because I know Republicans and Democrats both really believe that China would grow economically and grow out of communism, would grow beyond communism, and it didn't work. So where is the economy from your expertise in China, and how much did America help support that development?
Well, there's no question. I mean, let's just look at the tech sector. Almost every one of their tech billionaires got their start at Microsoft Laboratory in Beijing. So that's a microcosm, but I think that's applies more widely. Foreign investment was responsible for a lot of their growth. They became the world's factory. We would outsource everything to them, and I think that's starting to dry up. What I'm concerned about is that they were moving in this direction of economic autarky, pressuring less friendly to foreign investment in a number of key sectors, and this CHIPS decision is going to accelerate. It may take them 15 or 20 years to overcome it, but I think it's going to accelerate their effort to do so. And I also wonder, even our allies, our leverage with China really stems from our ability to form a coalition with like-minded allies like Europe and Japan. And so far, because our policies we walked away from free trade, and while the rest of the world is cutting trade deals week after week, that it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. We can't even find trade agreements with Europe, right? I mean, they have a different philosophy of regulation. And they've passed all kinds of regulations on digital marketing, on AI. We have none. Our dysfunction in Congress and the political system has cost us that. And so, if we could, for example, if we could go to the WTO with Europe and Japan and Korea and Australia united in a position for WTO reform, I think China would have to make some concessions. But we can't do that because we don't have a common position. I was very troubled when the Biden administration put out its recent national security strategy. The section on trade said nothing about global economic institutions. We should be pushing the WTOs in real crisis instead of the U.S. playing. We're the ones that created the Bretton Woods system, and we're kind of walking away from it to a large degree. So I think this can encourage more economic nationalism, not just in China, but among our allies as well.
Thank you so much. We only have a couple more minutes, but I'd like to give you both the same question. What are the good things the Biden administration has done towards China, and what are the not so good things? Clark or Robert?
Well,
either one.
Yeah, thanks for hosting this panel. It's been really edifying. In terms of good things, I think, maybe toning down the sort of really confrontational posture of the Trump administration, I think it is a good thing. I think it's a shame that the United States has not re-engaged on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I also think that it's a shame that we haven't lifted the tariffs. I think that it's abundantly clear that the tariffs were designed to change Chinese behavior. After 3 years, it's obvious that the policies have not changed Beijing's behavior, and instead have imposed costs on American consumers at a time when we have inflation at 8%. And so I think that we could take steps to make our economy stronger by lifting the tariffs and repositioning ourselves vis-a-vis China that way.
Okay, Robert. The good things of the Biden administration.
I would agree with most of what Clark said. I think one thing that would really help is if somebody could put tape on Biden's mouth. His unscripted, spontaneous remarks. He's been a senator for many, many decades, and sometimes when he says these things, I think he still thinks he's a senator. That you're the president of the United States. You can't just blurt out policy changes and then have your staff follow up and say no, everything's the same, because the Chinese don't believe it. When Biden says 4 times we're going to defend Taiwan, if you're Chinese, what do you believe? And so that's a problem. The lack of discipline is a problem. I think this chip ban, I'm agnostic. It may be the right thing to do. We have to see how it plays out. But I do think we've made a mistake by, as Clark said, these trade measures are designed to force changes in behavior and negotiations, and yet USTR's policy is we don't do trade agreements anymore, and so I think that's a big mistake, because but sustaining open trade is how we gain leverage on China, and so I think they've missed that one. I also think from the beginning they've been too. I think there's a mood of demonization in both countries, and I think that in Congress, China's everybody's favorite punching bag, and I'm not saying they don't deserve a lot of it, but everybody's rushing to show who's tougher on China, who hates China more. At the end of the day, China is the second largest economy in the world. They're a nuclear weapon state, and we have to find a way to coexist. And I think initially that was the impulse of the Biden administration to find how do we create a framework to manage competitive coexistence. And I think that in all the tit for tat, who's got more resolve and all that, I think a lot of that's gotten lost. I think this summit we just had was an effort to move in that direction, because both sides know that, you know, a single nuclear weapon can ruin your whole day.
Well, this has just been excellent. We'd like to invite you both back in 2 or 3 weeks, because I think we have a lot of questions to pursue further. We'd really like to understand why China hasn't developed its own chip production and manufacturing. We'd like to also understand why are they so interested in and almost forcing many of the islands in Oceania and the Pacific to cooperate or be cut off or isolated. Many more questions, and we would like to do another session of this program with you both. And it's just been a tremendous thing. We have the greatest respect for you, Clark, and the Cato Institute. And Robert, you're always so well informed and helpful. And we'll pass this along through the Washington Times and also through our networks of our listeners. We have quite a number of people that come in from all the sectors of the American government, and we're very honored to have such prestigious speakers with us today. I want to thank our audience and to all those that helped put this together, Alan Jessen and also Mr. Larry Moffat. Thank you very much. And we're really looking forward to our next session, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, if your time permits. Thank you, everybody.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks for
Take care.
having me. Bye.